nag-aalab ang puso. Sino pa naman ang masayang ang minamahal ay iwan upang ang buhay sugal at makipagsapalaran.
Magandang gabi po. This is Radyo Migrante on CHRY 105.5 FM, your leading source for diversity. That's at www.chry.fm, Bell 5973, Rogers Cable 945, or tunein.com. Ma'am Rhea is taking a break this week. So joining us today, we have Ish Cabanya. My name is Alex Felipe. So our guest tonight, we're doing a follow-up because last week's show, there were still a lot of questions out there, and some people sent us messages as well. So we're doing a second show on the changes to the Live-in Caregiver Program. And we have a really great guest today. Her name is Salimah Valiani. She's a longtime researcher on the issue of living caregivers and the author of the book, Rethinking Unequal Exchange, the Global Integration of Nursing Labor Markets. And recently, she wrote a really good analysis on the reforms on the Live-in Caregiver Program, and that's what we'll be discussing today. And so we'll be talking to her just after the news segment.
And for our Pulso ng Migrante segment, we have featured stories of caregiving professionals and a statement from Bayan Canada chairperson, Dr. Chandu Claver. And speaking of which, he was here in Toronto last night. Yeah, there was a Binadang Migrante's third anniversary. So congratulations to Binadang Migrante for their third anniversary. Agbiag ti Binadang for them, and matago-tago tako. Amen. I hope I said that correctly.
I was like, I think I'm just going to do that in English.
Papatayin ako ng relatives ko na Ilocano. Oh my God.
Can you tell us a little bit about Binadang?
So Binadang is an Igorot word which means solidarity, and the group has been existing here in Canada for 3 years now, and it's a group of indigenous peoples coming from the Cordillera region, the mountain provinces up north, and they're composed of people from different provinces, and they do advocacy work for indigenous rights, the welfare of Filipinos at home and abroad, particularly here in Ontario, and for the genuine change in our beloved country, the Philippines.
I was actually up there in the Cordillera this summer. So for relatively new listeners that might not know me, so I was I'm a host here at Radio Migrante, but I was gone for a few months because I was doing field work in the Philippines around the issue of mining. And so at one point I went to actually visit the Cordillera People's Alliance, which is a people's organization made up of Igorot or individuals up there in the Cordi, and they were telling me about there's been changes in the last few years with mining, because we've heard a lot about mining on this show, and if you're involved in activism here in the city or with the Filipino community, you know that the issue of gold mining is a pretty big deal for our people. And so they were telling me there that one thing that we should do a show on one of these days, and for people interested in the issue that you should look out for, is that gold mining is kind of changing in the northern Philippines, where before it was, we know about the problems with large-scale gold mining, so I'm not going to talk about that. But we usually talk about, up in the Cordi, how the Igorot peoples have had centuries of experience with gold mining, and it's a traditional form, and it's done by the community, and they're very cooperative in the way they do it, where everyone has a chance to mine. There's sharing of the wealth, but in recent years, is what the Cordillera People's Alliance were telling me, there's actually been a shift towards these what they called gold rush mining, where individuals strike out and try to find gold in these different areas. And when it's individual, not community based, it becomes this little mini capitalist system where they're trying to extract as much as they can. And there's also this movement with large scale as well, where they're partnering with small scale. So it's interesting changes happening there, and I think we'll do a show on that one of these days.
Yeah, and I guess there's some announcements on an event happening in December, and that will be by the end of this show. But first off, we'll go to the news, and I will start off. So, environmental activist, sustainable agriculture advocate dies. This is from DavaoToday.com. Francis Morales, environmental activist and advocate of sustainable agriculture, died Wednesday 11 p.m. evening, November 12th. due to acute lymphocytic leukemia. Morales' last engagement was the establishment of the Daluyong National Network of Disaster Survivors in Tacloban City last week. The sudden death came as a shock to his colleagues. Earlier this month, he suffered from pneumonia, but he strived to keep well and prepared for the Yolanda first-year anniversary. Morales spent a lifetime in various causes, starting with the anti-dictatorship movement during martial law, as executive director and board member of the National Group for Sustainable Agriculture, Masipag, and later as executive director of the Disaster Rebuilding Network, Balsa, Mindanao. We send our condolences to his wife, Nena Morales, and daughter, Umeira. He was 63.
And secondly, we just want to remind everyone that today's actually a very sad anniversary. It's the 10-year anniversary of the Hacienda Luisita massacre in Tarlac. And this past, in the Philippines yesterday, 500 people gathered in Tarlac to commemorate the 7 slain people at the massacre and the hundreds that were injured. And, up until now, it's been 10 years. There's been no formal recognition by the Philippine government of what happened there. And a lot of the land still, pretty much all the land hasn't been distributed yet, even though it's been government mandated or court mandated that it should be distributed. So that's something for all of us to keep in mind. And I'm cutting this a little short, this news segment, just so we can spend some time with our guests, because we're going to be talking about the changes that have happened to the Live-in Caregiver Program, now called the Caregiver Program. As we know, there's been a lot of news about this. People have been talking about this as if it's a positive development. And I think it's really important for us to look at it and ask ourselves, what does it really look like and how will it really affect the people that are going to be taking part in this program?
So we're very honored to have her, and she will share to us the realities of these recent changes. Dr. Salimah?
Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. How's everybody there tonight?
Doing all right in a cold York University evening. So thanks again so much for being on our show today. And so we talked a little bit before to get ready for the show. And so I think it'd be great to just introduce the topic by running through, what was the LCP, Live-in Caregiver Program, like before? And what are these new changes exactly? How is it going to affect people actually interested in applying to the program?
Okay, well, we could get into a long history of the program.
Oh, no, just the basics of how it works.
The most recent version of the program is something under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which allows people in Canada to hire caregivers who previously had to live in with their employers and care for either children or the elderly. And after at least 10 years of struggling, migrant caregivers fought and won the right to actually become permanent after finishing 2 years of full-time work in Canada. And that was something that was seen as a victory in the 90s. What has happened to the program now, even though there were a lot of problems with it before, is that victory of having the right to apply for permanent residency after 2 years of work inside a Canadian employer's home has now been taken away. Taken away in the sense that it's not all workers that complete that requirement, living in and working for 2 years, that will be able to apply for permanent residency in the reformed program. Now it's a limited number of workers coming in.
And they recently announced the cap, right?
Yeah, so that limit is 2,750 migrant caregivers who come in to take care of children. Supposedly, what we're told by government is that if the workers are coming in on their work permit to care for the elderly or the severely ill, then any number of them will be able to apply for permanent residency. So before it was anybody coming in under this program. Now it's only 2,750 people coming in to care for children and an unlimited number coming in to care for the elderly or the ill. Just to give you a sense of what that means, if you look between 2002 and 2013, that's a good, 10-year period for which we have solid numbers. The total number of workers coming in under the Live-in Caregiver Program has ranged from about 4,600 to almost 13,000. Right? So now you're going to have only 2,750 coming in with a sure chance to get in as permanent residents. That's a real fraction of the numbers that have been coming in to date.
And how are they going to be choosing? How does the application process work? So you're a caregiver. You've done 2 years within 4 years. This is under the new program because that's still there, right? 2 years within 4 years, and then now you apply for permanent residence. How does this work now? Or do we know how this works? How do they choose who gets?
I'm assuming that it's going to be on a first-come, first-served basis, right? So the first 2,750 migrant childcare providers that apply in that particular year and get processed will get the permanent residency spots. What it means is that the rest of the applicants that year will either go home or have to renew their temporary work permit. And then they would try another 2 years down the road after completing, within possibly another 4 years to get into the quota. One thing we don't know is what is the split in the program right now of workers coming in to care for children and workers coming in to care for everyone else. We don't know that number. We've never known it. It's never been published. Government probably knows it. But what we do know historically is that the program has been used by Canadian families needing childcare. The majority are that we come into contact with as advocates and activists are childcare providers. So, we do know in Canada that there's dire need for caregivers of the elderly. And so surely there are some migrant caregivers that are working in that area. But by far, I would say it is not the majority so far.
So to contrast this cap, there's 2,750 that's going to be the cap for those that get the permanent residence annually. There's two questions I have for this. There's that backlog. Even if they succeed in this miraculous 30,000 that they're supposed to cut that backlog down by for next year, there's still more than that, than the 30,000. So and they're still letting in caregivers in every year. Will there be a similar cap? Well, I guess first question, will there be a similar cap for how many they let into the program yearly? Will it also be 2,750? Or is that still going to be open? And then secondly, what about the rest of the backlog?
Okay, well, we have to think back to how the program was working with the non-cap system, previously. And what I found in a paper that I published in 2009 is that of the workers that came in a 5-year period, starting around 2003 to 2009, less than half were getting permanent residency anyway. Okay, so they were they were doing their 2 years of full-time work in a Canadian home while living in, but less than half were actually getting permanent residency. So why is that? Well, again, we don't have the exact numbers from government. That was an estimate that I did, and you can look that you can look that paper up on my blog, which is salimahvaliani.wordpress.com. We have to speculate, right? So I estimated for that period of time, and my guess is that workers were not able to finish the 2 years within a 3-year period or a 4-year period or a 2-year period because they had very difficult working conditions. So they had to leave their employer, find a new employer. They end up either being deported, either leaving the job, or renewing with a new temporary work permit for another 2 years. And so already the system was not absorbing the temporary migrant caregivers like it was promising to do. And now with a cap, it's going to be even less. Unfortunately, this is no surprise, though, because when we think about it, we're in a country, Canada, which today is no longer producing enough children to reproduce the workforce. So we are fully dependent now on people coming in, workers immigrating to Canada to reproduce the workforce. And instead of doing that in a sustainable way, which means letting people come in on a permanent basis, which is really the way that the population was rebuilt in this country now called Canada, after we decimated so many Indigenous people, we are reproducing the workforce by bringing in temporary migrant workers. And live-in caregivers are one part of that. So we know that most temporary migrant workers don't become permanent. They come in temporarily and they leave permanently. And so now, with this reform of the Live-in Caregiver Program, live-in caregivers will face the same fate.
And with the non-cap system before, the context was the live-in was a requirement for the caregivers. Now there is the option to live out. What are the implications for caregivers? Do you find any disadvantage on their part? For example, more expense for them since they have to pay the rent as well, and others?
Very good. That's another part of the reform that I didn't touch on so far. And that we can see as a victory. The fact that the workers don't have to live in with the employer anymore is something we have been asking for years, right? We've been demanding that because living with your employer obviously can lead into a lot of coercive and abusive situations. And we know that from not only live-in caregivers, but say farm workers who are migrants and have to live on the farm where they work. And they will be woken up in the middle of the night to go and do a shift, whether they like it or not. Live-in caregivers will be expected to work overtime, whether they like it or not. And that won't necessarily change so much, even though the workers no longer have to live in. Why? One, because live-in caregivers don't make much money in Canada, and caregivers, period, don't make much money. They make minimum wage. Domestic care work is one of the most undervalued jobs in the Canadian labor market. So we can expect to see that migrant caregivers choose to live in anyway, especially if the employer offers it, and if the charge is minimal for the room at the employer's home. Technically, government says that employers are not allowed to charge, but we don't see in the reform any means by which government will make sure it doesn't happen. So apparently it was never allowed in the program that employers charge for room and board, but we know they have been.
Mm-hmm.
So why would a worker choose to live in? Well, as I said, if you come to work, say, in Toronto or any major city in Canada today, minimum wage is not a living wage. So you don't make much money. And as a migrant worker, you're coming in with a lot of obligations from day one. Firstly, for recruitment fees, which is typically the way that temporary migrants enter Canada. And two, you're coming to work in Canada because you have a family that you need to support. And even at minimum wage in any Canadian city, you're making more than what you would at home. So you need to send money home. So without changing the way that we actually value care work in Canada, things are not going to improve for migrant caregivers. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum in care work, which would be the highest paid care workers, registered nurses, the value is there in terms of money. They make a very good salary thanks to the right to unionize, but their working conditions are hell. And these are some of the most unhealthy workers in the Canadian society. And this is not migrant nurses, but all nurses generally. So what is the general problem in Canada in terms of the way we care for the people who care for us?
And I'm going to read another question from one of our listeners here. And she asks an unpopular question. So she says, I really want you to correct me if I'm looking at this the wrong way. It's hard to get ahead in Canada if you don't speak English well, have Canadian experience and education. These new changes to the Live-in Caregiver Program make sure that you have these things. So isn't this a good thing for Filipino migrants?
I think it's a great question because we wonder what the experience is for immigrants who do come in as permanent residents but then can't find jobs in their professions and end up working in factories and other very low-paying jobs. So on the one hand, sure, it's good if there's tests that we can take and prove to Canadian employers that we have the right language and other so-called skills. But I think and generally in the immigration system in Canada, these tests, especially language tests, are a must. So if you're applying for permanent residency, no matter which category, you need to pass either an English or French test. Also, in the reform of the Live-in Caregiver Program, it's specified that workers who are caring for the elderly and the ill, who don't have that cap, so they can apply for permanent residency after doing their 2 years, will have to also prove that they've passed other tests in their caregiving field. So that can be seen as good, but the key point that makes it not so good is that when you come in as a temporary migrant, you don't have to pass those tests. So we're willing in Canada to let workers in and make them work in the jobs that they've already obtained through a recruitment agency, say, with a Canadian employer, without having those tests filled. But only when they apply for permanent residency are we going to now require the test. So what is it? It's a way of excluding people, and excluding people that we have already let in to work for a certain period, right? So that's how we need to look at it. And even if you do have your test score and so on, it's it's not clear that you're going to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
So if that test was to guarantee you a job in Canada, that would mean something very different, right?
And so that's a really, so that kind of touches on the other stream, you know, this high medical needs stream that you say has an unlimited cap. I thought that was also at 2,700, but that's interesting that they say it's unlimited. But you bring up all these challenges to how do they actually get the license after 2 years of caregiving work within 4 years? You know, how is this going to affect them? And how do you think the bodies like the Ontario College of Nurses, how are they looking at this? Because they're the ones that provide the licenses, right?
Right. So the way I read the new rule is that actually the license or the training requirement has to be obtained in the 2-year period of full-time work as a temporary migrant worker.
So you got to do both.
Right. How do you do that? Especially if you are working full-time and earning minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in terms of the College of Nurses or other bodies, ultimately it's the market that's going to determine which workers stay on as permanent residents and which workers get jobs. So if, for example, in Ontario, which is the case, we are cutting back on healthcare spending and we're cutting back on registered nurses, well then a temporary migrant registered nurse isn't going to have a very good chance staying in the province and working as a registered nurse, whether she has a Canadian credential or not. So ultimately what matters is what kind of jobs we have available. And in that sense, what we can see is that really the jobs are expanding for personal support workers. We know already that through the Live-in Caregiver Program, we're bringing in some highly educated workers. Whether they are nurses, doctors as well from the Philippines are increasingly known to be coming under the Live-in Caregiver Program, or whether they're teachers or high-level administrators.
Mm-hmm.
If those people end up getting a PSW credential in order to stay in Canada, I'm not so sure that that is the best way to go.
And I have a colleague, I told you earlier that I went back to grad school, and one of my colleagues is studying this exact phenomenon, the phenomenon of former LCP participants. And a very good number of them are moving towards getting personal support workers, becoming personal support workers after they quote-unquote graduate from the program, the LCP. So, you know, she asks me, my colleague, she asked me to ask you, you know, can't we connect this to the general devaluation of care work in the Canadian market in general? So you've touched on this before, but both for migrants and for non-migrants. And she also asks, you know, isn't all of this connected really to the global conditions, the global and national economic conditions, and what needs to be done to really change things if it's such a global phenomenon, if it's not just limited to Canada?
Absolutely, that is the larger perspective in which we need to see all this. Around the world, what we need more and more are caregivers, whether it's nurses, doctors, caregivers based at home. And if we don't value these workers, if we don't appreciate them and reward them, they are going to have to be constantly leaving home in search of a better situation. So in Canada, say a registered nurse, again, the very high band of workers in the caregiving structure, tend to go to the U.S. So in Ontario, we have 6,000 nurses that work outside of the province. Can you imagine in the most poorly populated province in terms of RNs to residents, we're losing 6,000 a year. And, maybe it's the same 6,000 each year that keep on working outside. But so that's one example. Then you have the other end. You have, say, a doctor in Sri Lanka who isn't being respected and valued there and comes here to work in through the Live-in Caregiver Program, or the Caregiver Program as it's called now. And so on the one hand, we need these caregivers. We need them as children. We need them as the ill. We need them as the elderly. We don't want to value them. And so we chase them away. And the more we chase them away, the more we need. And the more we need, the more we seem to undervalue. It's a crazy, vicious circle. And I think the solution is to begin at home. Start respecting the workers at home at the national level and give them the choice not to leave. And we will see a lot less abuse, and we'll see a lot more respect.
In your blog post, Salimah, you wrote, in quotes, "The reform invites division and competition among workers already difficult to organize given their precarious immigration status." And since the announcement was made the last day of October, there had been mixed feelings from the members of the community. And I guess my question would be, there are still many details that yet to be released since the first announcement for the changes. What are still the big questions that you are thinking of that is yet to be answered by the government?
Yeah, from my discussions with different caregiver advocates across the country, there are a lot of questions, and they have put them forward to Citizenship and Immigration Canada, and they're waiting for answers. That might explain partly why we haven't seen very many positions put out yet by the actual workers' groups. One question that I can think of right off the bat is, if there's a quota on the migrant childcare providers, but not the migrant elderly care, say, what is going to stop Canadian employers from obliging their migrant caregivers to care for both an elderly and a child member of the family? So to be more specific, this, in a sense, can be used by employers to extract more from the migrant caregiver, in that if a caregiver is going to have a better chance to stay on permanently by caring for an elderly person, that worker may feel obliged, or may be easier to use as a caregiver for both the children in the family and the elderly. And so it's actually going to make the program yet more exploitative. So that's one question that I have. Another question I think you put to me earlier, and I gave you my sense of an answer, but we need to ask government, how are you going to choose the 2,750 migrant child caregivers every year to grant permanent residency? Another question we need to ask is, how are you going to enforce that migrant caregivers are not abused in their place of work? Because the place of work is still the home. The home is, in many provincial legal frameworks, not a workplace and can't be inspected by labor inspectors. So, how are these workers going to be protected?
And so to close, we've got about 2.5 minutes. A lot of our listeners are actually from the Philippines. So if you have 2 minutes, what message would you have for them, those that are prospective, thinking about coming or applying to Canada? Because we talked a little bit about, having to pay these fees to agents to come over here, and we know that's technically illegal, but we know that it happens, and we know that people are taking courses in the Philippines. They're paying money just to be able to come to become living caregivers. With these recent changes, what message would you want to give them?
My message to migrant workers and prospective migrant workers is really not so different today, now that the program has changed, to what it was yesterday before the changes. Why? Because for migrant workers, what they need to think about is coming to Canada. Try to find out what your rights are before coming, and try to connect with bodies like the Canadian Labour Congress, particular unions, for example, the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions or CUPE, which are active in the caregiving sectors, so that you can be armed again with some information about your rights and about the obligations that workers, that government and employers have to you as a worker. And when you come to Canada, don't be afraid to reach out and meet people beyond the workplace, because that's the only way that workers can meet each other. So migrant workers can meet local workers, and together they can tackle the problems that are being faced. In many cases, workers face the same problems, whether they're based in Canada or somewhere else today, given the extreme power that employers now have.
On that note, thank you very much for gracing our show, Dr. Salimah Valiani. And her blog is here at salimahvaliani.wordpress.com, and that will be posted on our Radyo Migrante Facebook page. As well, I'd like to also mention for Filipino listeners who are looking for prospects for migrant work, just look up Migrante International or Migrante Canada for more information. And we have a big network of migration and labor advocates to help you with more details. And
thank you very much to Dr. Salimah Valiani. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks to Migrante for all your great work.
Thank you. So, dito sa Pulso ng Migrante, kagabi, nag-interview si Madam Rhea.
Hi, Rhea.
Hello, Madam Rhea. So, nag-interview si Madam Rhea ng mga tao na graduate na at naging parte ng caregiver program, no? So, nagkaroon siya ng opportunity rin na makausap sila sa kanilang practical na experience. Lalo pa isang statement mula sa Bayan Canada chairperson, si Dr. Constancio Chandu Claver, para sa kanyang insights dun sa pagbabago dun sa caregiver program. So ito na po.
Siguro para sa akin sa ngayon na matagal na yung papel ko, parang hindi ko na inisip yung abuso, yung mga ganon. Ang inisip ko kung gaano pa ako katagal maghihintay sa pamilya ko. Which is parang pag titignan ko yung bagong caregiver program ngayon, parang napaka-unfair para sa aming naghintay na ng napakatagal. Parang sabi namin na, ang nauuna yung 2013-2014 applicants. Paano naman kami between 2009 and 2012? Parang napaka-unfair talaga. Naghihintay na kami ng 5 to 7 years. Tapos, how come na yung mga new applicants, sila na ang parang, yehey! Parang ang saya-saya nila. Pero may mga nakakasalubong ako sa mga kalsada, sa mga bus stop na sinasabi rin nila na, paano yan, hindi rin kami handa financially. Yun ang ano nila. So, kahit na naka-medical na sila, andyan na yung visa ng mga pamilya nila, pero yung fear sa kanila na dadatnan ng pamilya dito, parang ando doon rin. Kami nga na matagal na dito, 5 to 7 years, wala pang ipon. Yung mga baguhan kaya, yung newly open, na may mga open work permit na 2013, 2014. Mas lalong wala rin silang ipon, nakagaya rin namin. Kaya ang hirap din. Sa amin na mas nauna ang pakiusap lang namin sa gobyerno, unahin din sana kami. Wag yung natabunan na yung yung papel namin, yun ang feeling namin. Parang nakalimutan na kami, napabayaan na kami. Hanggang kailan ang paghintay?
Rhea, ang masasabi ko dito sa changes na ibinigay ng gobyerno sa caregiver program, hindi ito yung solusyon. Kasi ang hinihingi natin ay protection ng mga caregivers, pero hindi nila ito pinakinggan. Binigay nila ang isang programa na walang kasiguraduhan ang mga caregivers na magkaroon ng permanent residence dito sa Canada.
Para sa akin, hindi ako sang-ayon sa panibagong ng LCP ngayon dahil para sa akin, tactical lang yun ng immigration para mas mapaalis yung pagiging residente na mga nasa live-in caregiver program. Tulad nung adults and children na live-in caregivers, mas mapapababa yung mga pwedeng pumasok na live-in caregivers papunta ng Canada.
Para sa akin, hindi po ako sangayon sa pagbabago sa immigration sa ngayon, lalo na po sa live-in caregiver. For example po, doon sa pagiging live-in or live-out ng mga caregiver, kasi kung magli-live-in ka or magli-live-out ka, parehas pa rin yung sahod. Paano pag sa live-out, yung minimum wage lang yung ibibigay sa'yo ng amo, kailangan mo ng mas malaking pera kasi nga magbabayad ka ng renta, magbabayad ka pamasahe, pagkain, lahat-lahat. Pero anong mangyayari sa mga caregivers kung minimum wage lang ang ibibigay? Sinong makikinabang sa mga yung mga amo lang. So, hindi po ako sangayon sa mga pagbabago ngayon sa immigration. Salamat po.
Good day to the listeners of Radyo Migrante. And this is a bad time that we are in at this time. In the last several months, there have been rapid pronouncements about changes happening in the sectors of the temporary foreign workers here in Canada, as well as just recently, with regards to live-in caregivers here in Canada. And this have profound effect on the plight of our kababayan, or the plight of our co-Filipino workers here in Canada. The LCP changes are especially deceitful, actually, because although there was the positive thing about them pulling out the live-in requirement for the live-in caregiver program, they have actually put a cap on the number of live-in caregivers who could actually be approved for permanent residency after they have fulfilled all the requirements required from the live-in caregiver program in order to apply for permanent residency. The numbers in the past show that the number of live-in caregivers applying for permanent residency is much more than what they're offering to approve after November 30. They say that they will be approving 2,750 for 2 pathways, which is a total of around 5,000 maybe. But that's well below the number of live-in caregivers actually applying for permanent residency yearly. And the thing is that I said deceitful because the Canadian government has couched its pronouncements in the language as if it is something that is very beneficial for Filipinos. The live-in caregiver requirement, the pulling out of the live-in caregiver live-in requirement for the caregiver program has been a demand that has been there for years. But then, for them to put a cap on the number of live-in caregivers actually being approved for permanent residency is actually something that we never asked for. It's something that makes our efforts to improve the plight of live-in caregivers futile. we have to accept also that now, I mentioned about the temporary foreign workers, and we also have to remember that April 2015 will be the deadline for many temporary foreign workers who have applied after April 2010 but have not been able to get their permanent residency by April 2015. All these temporary foreign workers would probably have to be sent home. And this is something that, again, puts our kababayans in a very bad situation. And this is where we're demanding that the Philippine government should be assisting in this situation, because although the Philippine government has been pushing migration of people, Filipinos outside of the Philippines, pushing them out of the Philippines in order to find work through its labor export program, they have never really been very dutiful in trying to protect these migrant workers when they have problems. April 2015 is a date that would probably cause a lot of our Filipino migrants to become undocumented, and we have not seen any response from the Philippine government, from the state, as to what they would do in order to assist the migrants. We demand that the Philippine government actually look into this and provide safety nets, if not advocate to the Canadian governments for something to be done, because in the first place, it was the Philippine government that pushed migrant workers out of the Philippines. It is therefore their responsibility also to actually do something about this.
And that was a segment by Rhea Gamana. Maraming salamat, ma'am. So that makes up our show for today. Maraming salamat sa lahat for listening to Radyo Migrante. Just a quick list of announcements. So in light of the new regulations by the Canadian federal government about the LCP, the Caregivers Action Centre invites you to join caregivers and allies in a solidarity walk on November 22nd. That's Saturday from 3 to 4 p.m. starting at 150 King Street West. That's the Federal Minister's Office. And we'll be posting that on the Radio Migrante page. This coming Sunday as well, the Filipino Christian Fellowship Church invites you to their second anniversary Advent worship and lunch. That's this coming Sunday, November 23rd, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. at 255 Finch Avenue West.
And for folks in Alberta, temporary foreign workers, advocates, and supporters are invited to join the information session on the caregiver or the temporary foreign worker program. That's on Sunday, December 7th, 4 p.m. at the Royal Canadian Legion. And the address will be posted on the Radio Migrante Facebook page. The guest speaker for that event is Yesi Bill, lawyer for the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. And lastly, for listeners who are interested for joining Radyo Migrante Collective, nais ba ninyong maging bahagi ng Radyo Migrante? Halina't sumali sa Radyo Migrante. Kung kayo ay interesado bilang volunteer, pwede kayong maging board operator, tagapagbalita, tagasaliksik, or social media archivist. Kontakin niyo lang ang radmig105.5fm at gmail.com or radmig105.5fm at gmail.com, o kaya tumawag sa bilang 647-281-0652 for more information. And shoutouts, congratulations to Unifil Migrante Hong Kong for their 14th Congress earlier today.
And stay tuned. Up next is Roy Green and Odyssey. So thanks again for listening to Radio Migrante, and join us again next week. Good night.
Good night.